It's not merely a coincidence. There's a profound underlying reason for the subtle shifts and pervasive feelings you've been experiencing lately. You are not adrift. You are being meticulously prepared. This unfolding isn't random. It's a precisely orchestrated process. Something has been quietly, almost imperceptibly, interacting with you. Not through dramatic external events, nor through overt linguistic messages, but through the deep, intricate pathways of your nervous system. There exists a connection, an energetic thread, that has always linked the human nervous system to the Pleiades. For eons, this link has largely remained dormant, a passive potential. But in this current era, it has become active, stirring from its slumber. What's remarkable, and often overlooked, is that most people will never consciously detect this activation because they simply do not know how or where to direct their attention. This isn't about some external entity arriving. It's about a profound, internal reception. The Pleiades, often steeped in myth and misinterpretation, have been fundamentally misunderstood for a long time. Not because the details were wrong, but because the entire direction of inquiry was misplaced. This emergent interaction isn't about receiving data through spoken or written language. It's about a field of awareness that communicates through sensitivity, through an innate attunement. And right now, that interaction is not becoming louder or more dramatic. It's becoming exquisitely more precise and specific. This heightened specificity is precisely why so many misinterpret it. They assume something is amiss, a system failure or a flaw, when in truth, something essential is being refined. Many believe that profound change initiates in the mind, yet the mind is, paradoxically, the least reliable starting point. It's a remarkably permeable landscape, easily influenced by external narratives, readily convinced by fleeting thoughts, and even more susceptible to distortion. You can harbor one firm conviction in the morning and find yourself swayed to its absolute opposite by nightfall. That isn't stability, that's the incessant static of mental noise. The nervous system, however, operates on an entirely different plane. It doesn't engage in debates, it doesn't pretend, and it cannot fabricate its state. It simply responds. If an influence were guiding human awareness at a foundational level, it would bypass the ephemeral realm of thoughts. It would move directly through the one biological structure that cannot fake its state, cannot lie about its condition, your nervous system. For it is your nervous system that registers and decides everything before your conscious mind even begins to construct an explanation. If it's stable, your perception is crystal clear. If it's unstable, everything becomes misread, distorted, even the simplest truths directly before you. Your mind weaves narratives, but your nervous system whispers the unvarnished truth. This fundamental distinction is why the current experience isn't about acquiring new knowledge or having something added to your being. It's about stabilizing what is already inherently yours. Because once the system through which you perceive reality becomes steady and calibrated, your vision of the world transforms without anything in your external environment needing to change at all. Not all pressure signifies the same thing. To treat every form of internal pressure as identical is where most people falter in their understanding. The pressure you are feeling right now isn't random. It is remarkably specific, carrying distinct messages. Some individuals describe a tight, restless pressure, a feeling of being unable to sit still, as if an invisible force is constantly tugging their attention away from the present. This isn't an indication of mental overload, it's a form of avoidance. Their system isn't collapsing, it's actively refusing to engage with something it intuitively knows must be confronted. Others experience a heavy, almost paralyzing weight, distinct from panic or anxiety. It's a slow, dense pressure that makes every action feel disproportionately difficult. This isn't a sign of weakness, it's a symptom of misalignment. They are carrying energetic burdens and beliefs that their deeper system no longer resonates with. Instead of simply reacting, their nervous system is beginning to push back, slowing everything down as a profound act of resistance. And then there are those who feel a sharp, alert tension, focused, controlled, almost like the tautness of a bowstring before an arrow is released, signaling that something significant is imminent but not yet manifested. This isn't the corrosive grip of stress, it's a profound state of readiness. Their system isn't breaking down, it's being sharpened, honed into something exquisitely precise. The pressure itself is not the problem, it is the vital message that many refuse to decipher. Because if you fail to understand the specific language of your pressure, you will squander precious energy trying to escape it. But if you learn to read it correctly, it will reveal precisely what your system is striving to transform. For too long, overthinking has been erroneously equated with intellectual depth. People often assume that if they are constantly analyzing, questioning, and running endless scenarios through their minds, it signifies heightened awareness, careful deliberation, or even superior intelligence. But what is now becoming glaringly obvious, especially in these times, is that most overthinking is not clarity at all. It is hesitation. It is the mental compensatory mechanism that kicks in when the deeper system beneath the mind doesn't feel stable enough to confidently move forward. So the mind, in a frantic attempt to regain control, loops through endless possibilities, trying desperately to figure it out, instead of simply seeing it. And this is why it has become so utterly exhausting. Not because life itself is inherently more complicated, but because something within you is beginning to profoundly reject that way of functioning entirely. You are starting to notice that thinking more isn't yielding the clarity it once seemed to. In fact, the more you mentally process everything, the more muddled and indistinct it feels. This is not a failure, it is a fundamental shift. Because what is starting to emerge isn't another layer of complex thought. It is something faster, more direct, and undeniably harder to articulate. A kind of internal knowing that doesn't arrive step by step. It simply lands whole and complete. And if your system is sufficiently stable, you recognize it instantly with an undeniable resonance. If it's not, you will question it, doubt it, and inevitably fall back into the familiar yet exhausting patterns of overthinking. This is where the ancient connection to the Pleiades becomes profoundly relevant in a way that often eludes conventional understanding. It's not about receiving a deluge of new information from the cosmos. It's about reducing the fundamental need to constantly process information in the first place. It's about making clarity feel immediate and intrinsic, rather than something you must relentlessly chase and construct. The clearer your internal state becomes, the less you will feel the compulsive urge to endlessly ruminate about it. And this is precisely where a significant internal divide begins to manifest. Because when things become undeniably clear, not everyone moves forward. Some freeze. They hesitate. They retreat into analysis, desperately seeking more confirmation, more external reassurance, more time to deliberate. But the path unfolding ahead does not wait for such cautious contemplation. The individuals who navigate this transition with grace and efficacy won't be those who subjected every detail to endless mental scrutiny. They will be the ones whose underlying system didn't lock up the moment the path became obvious. Because, at a certain critical juncture, overthinking ceases to be a form of protection and begins to transform into the very force that holds you paralyzed in place. If you step back and observe the human system from a different vantage point, you realize it's not merely reacting to the world. It's a sophisticated organic receiver and transmitter, constantly taking in and sending out information at levels most people don't consciously register. Not in a mystical, ethereal sense, but in a deeply functional, biological one. Your internal state profoundly determines what signals you pick up, how clearly you perceive them, and what you ultimately do with that information once it's received. This is where the concept of signal strength becomes critically important. because not everyone is receiving the same exact input, even if they are in the same environment, observing the same situation. Some people feel perpetually scattered, easily overwhelmed, and effortlessly thrown off balance. Their attention darts erratically, their emotional reactions spike disproportionately, and every external input feels amplified beyond necessity. This isn't simply stress, it's a profound state of distortion. When the system is inflamed, perpetually tense, or inherently unstable, the internal signal weakens, becoming muddled. Things are habitually misread. Minor inputs feel crushing, while genuinely important cues get utterly lost in the pervasive noise. But when the system is regulated, when it's steady, deeply grounded, and no longer caught in a continuous loop of reactive responses, something fundamental shifts. The same external reality, the same inputs, but the internal interpretation becomes sharper, cleaner, and astonishingly more accurate. You don't suddenly receive more information when you are stable, you simply misread significantly less. And that is the subtle yet monumental difference most people fail to recognize. This isn't about acquiring something novel, it's about precisely removing the interference, the static, that was already present. Because the clearer your internal system becomes, the more precise the received signal feels. Not louder, not more dramatic, but simply more exact in its truth. And this is where the Pleiadian connection seamlessly integrates. If there is indeed a refined, guiding influence interacting with human awareness, it would never force itself through the cacophony of internal noise. It would naturally align with the systems that are inherently capable of receiving it without distortion, which means the ultimate question isn't whether the signal is present, but whether your system is clear enough and tuned enough to recognize it when it is. For much of our lives, most people have not actually been listening to their own internal system. They have been overriding it, pushing past clear physical signals, ignoring energetic limits, second-guessing innate instincts, and habitually waiting for external validation before taking any action. Over time, this creates a profound internal gap where the body, in its wisdom, eventually stops expecting to be heard, and the mind, in its analytical dominance, takes over everything. When this occurs, life ceases to flow effortlessly. Instead, everything feels like it must be forced. Decisions become burdensome, feeling heavy and fraught. Reactions feel either delayed and sluggish or disproportionately exaggerated. Even the simplest tasks begin to demand more effort than they should, not because they are inherently difficult, but because there is a deep misalignment between what you instinctively feel and what you consciously compel yourself to do. But something is beginning to change. Not in a sudden, dramatic upheaval, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, your system is starting to respond differently when it is no longer constantly dismissed. You begin to notice that when you follow an internal prompting immediately, without over-processing it mentally, there is significantly less resistance afterward, less second-guessing, less internal friction, less regret. This is not mere coincidence. This is your system, in its innate intelligence, recognizing that it is finally being trusted again. And trust, in this profound internal dynamic, works both ways. The more you stop overriding its subtle guidance, the more it stops needing to send signals in extremes just to capture your attention. It no longer needs to push as hard because it knows you will respond to its quieter prompts. Your body doesn't need to shout when it knows you are genuinely listening. This is where things begin to feel profoundly smoother. Not because external life suddenly becomes devoid of challenges, but because you are no longer operating in constant opposition to yourself in every small decision. What once felt like immense effort begins to feel natural, almost effortless. What used to demand constant mental deliberation now happens spontaneously, without hesitation. And it doesn't feel like you are gaining something entirely new. It feels like something ancient and vital is finally returning to its rightful, intended state. Because when your body stops fighting you, When your nervous system aligns, everything begins to move without that constant internal resistance that used to drag and slow everything down. Most people don't fully grasp how much of their daily behavior is intrinsically built around coping mechanisms. These are small habits, automatic distractions, deeply ingrained patterns of thinking or reacting that help regulate how they feel in the moment, without ever truly addressing the underlying cause of their discomfort. Over extended periods, these compensatory systems become fully automatic, so ingrained that you no longer even consciously notice them. You simply rely on them to maintain a semblance of internal balance. But what happens when those very same patterns, those trusted coping strategies, suddenly stop working? That is precisely where profound discomfort begins to set in. Things that once reliably calmed you down no longer have the same effect. Certain routines that provided solace now feel hollow, as if they've lost their potency. Even the familiar ways you used to distract yourself start to feel ineffective, almost as if your system is no longer responsive to them. This isn't a sign of something breaking down. It's a profound indication of something being outgrown. Because those coping mechanisms were never designed to be permanent solutions. They were temporary scaffoldings, provisional ways of maintaining stability when your deeper system wasn't fully regulated on its own. And now, as something far deeper within you begins to stabilize itself, those external supports are starting to gently, yet decisively, fall away. The initial transition, however, doesn't feel smooth. It often feels like something vital is being stripped away, leaving a void before something new and solid has fully replaced it. This uncomfortable gap creates immense uncertainty, and most people, driven by instinct, respond by desperately trying to revert to old habits, attempting to force them to work again. But they won't. Once your system no longer depends on something, it will not permit you to rely on it in the same old way again. And that is where the fundamental shift truly takes hold. Because if those old mechanisms are leaving, it's not to leave you exposed and vulnerable. It's to gently, yet firmly nudge you into a state where regulation no longer arises from external distraction, but from intrinsic stability itself, a state where you don't need as many protective layers just to feel okay in your own skin. It may not feel entirely comfortable at first, but it is incredibly precise. Because what is being removed isn't arbitrary. It is anything your system no longer requires to hold itself together. For the vast majority of human history, the nervous system has been exquisitely shaped around one singular, overriding priority: survival. React quickly, assume the worst, and move before you fully comprehend what's happening. This ancient wiring served us exceptionally well when the environment was truly unpredictable, and immediate physical danger was a constant reality. But that same ingrained circuitry, carried into the complexities of modern life, creates something very different. It generates overreactions, frequent misreads of situations, and decisions made either too early or too late, driven by internal pressure rather than genuine clarity. You feel a subtle internal shift, and before you even fully understand its nature, your system has already labeled it as a threat, an urgency, or a problem that demands immediate resolution. That is the old pattern, deeply embedded. But something profound is beginning to shift, and it's subtle enough that most people don't recognize it at first. The ingrained instinct to react immediately is starting to weaken, to gently dissolve, and in its place, something else is quietly forming, something slower yet far more precise. You begin to notice moments where you don't jump to conclusions with the same old urgency. Situations that would have instantly triggered a reactive cascade now create a brief, almost imperceptible pause. Not born of confusion, but of an emergent clarity. You are no longer rushing to interpret. You are allowing the full, nuanced picture to settle within you before you make your move. And that changes everything. Because when you are not reacting out of fear, you are no longer merely guessing at reality. You are truly seeing it, This is where the idea of the nervous system being rewired starts to make profound sense. Not in a dramatic, physical alteration, but in a fundamental reordering of how it prioritizes response. It's no longer exclusively built around sheer speed. It's starting to favor accuracy above all else. This means less second-guessing, because the initial read of a situation is already inherently clearer. It means a significant reduction in urgency, because not everything feels like it demands immediate, frantic action. And it means your internal timing begins to change in ways that are difficult to explain intellectually, but impossible to ignore experientially. You act when it is genuinely right, not merely when it feels intensely pressing. The moment you stop frantically reacting to everything, you begin to truly respond to what actually matters. This isn't hesitation, it is refinement, a sophisticated recalibration. And once you experience it, you realize how much of your previous decisions were shaped by internal pressure, by a desperate need to relieve tension, rather than by genuine understanding. How often you moved too quickly, not because it was the correct move, but simply to alleviate an uncomfortable internal state. Now, that old pressure loses its authority. You no longer feel the compulsive need to resolve everything instantly. You don't feel pulled into every situation that screams for your attention. There's a kind of automatic internal filtering that occurs, a deep discernment where you can sense what truly deserves your energy and what doesn't. And that's where this becomes something far more significant than just personal change. Because if the nervous system begins to prioritize accuracy over primal fear, the entire way you experience reality shifts in tandem. You are no longer navigating through layers of assumptions and projections. You are moving through direct, unadulterated perception. And that's not something you learn from a textbook. It's something your system either supports or it doesn't. Most people remain unaware of how much of their daily life is subtly controlled by low-level panic. Not overt, debilitating fear, not constant, crippling anxiety, but a pervasive, subtle, ongoing state where everything feels slightly urgent, slightly important, slightly demanding of your immediate attention. It manifests in the compulsive urge to respond quickly, even when absolutely nothing is forcing your hand. It's in the way small, inconsequential situations feel disproportionately large and significant. It's in the way your energy feels constantly pulled in multiple directions, not because everything genuinely matters, but because your system is conditioned to treat it as if it does. This becomes your unconscious baseline, without you ever truly noticing its oppressive presence. And when that is your baseline, life doesn't feel clear or expansive. It feels crowded, overwhelming, and mentally exhausting. Too many thoughts vying for attention, too many fragmented reactions happening simultaneously, too many moments where you're trying desperately to keep up, instead of actually seeing and being present with what's unfolding. But when the nervous system begins its profound journey of stabilization, that entire layer of low-level panic starts to dissolve. Not instantly, not with a dramatic flourish, but noticeably, gradually. You begin to feel spaciousness where there used to be a crushing pressure. Situations that would have once automatically pulled you into their vortex no longer exert the same magnetic grip. You don't feel that automatic, reflexive need to react, to fix, to respond immediately, simply to alleviate internal tension. Instead, there is a distinct pause. But it's not hesitation. It's a moment of profound internal spaciousness. And within that emergent clarity, decisions often start to happen faster than they ever did before. But without the chaos, the anxiety, or the mental turmoil that used to surround them. You don't need to laboriously think through every conceivable angle. You don't need to run endless scenarios in your head to feel certain. You simply see what makes intrinsic sense, and you move. You don't need more time to decide. You need significantly less interference while you are deciding. Because when the system isn't panicking, it's not distorting what you are seeing. It's not exaggerating what is unimportant or shrinking what truly matters. Everything begins to appear in its actual, undistorted proportion. And that profoundly changes how you experience people. You begin to notice subtle cues immediately that you would have entirely overlooked before. Not because you are analyzing more, but because your perception is no longer clouded by unnecessary internal reactions. You can sense when something is genuinely off without needing external proof. You can feel when something is intrinsically right without needing reassurance or validation. And that kind of clarity is quiet, subtle, but undeniably powerful. If you've stayed with me through these thoughts, I truly appreciate your presence and attention. You don't need to rush to fully understand everything that's happening inside you, nor do you need to intellectualize every subtle shift. Not everything is meant to be figured out immediately. Some things are simply meant to be felt, to be recognized in the quiet depths of your being, and to be allowed to settle into their own organic rhythm. If something in this narrative resonated with you, even slightly, then you are already more deeply in tune, more exquisitely aware than you might consciously realize. You are not behind. You are not missing anything crucial. You are adjusting, recalibrating, and evolving in ways that aren't always obvious or dramatic at first glance. So, whatever subtle shifts you notice within yourself moving forward, don't fight them, and don't try to force them back into something familiar or comfortable. You don't have to actively chase this emerging awareness. You simply have to stay present enough, curious enough, and open enough to recognize it when it is undeniably there.